and thank you to the Gadigal people and respect to the elders past and present. As I mentioned yesterday, that as the traditional owners of the land, but also the traditional community housing providers who had a lot of this sort of stuff in place for many thousands of years and provided all the things that we now call wraparound services as part of that. And that's one of the strengths. For those that heard me yesterday, it's all downhill from yesterday. But one of the strengths of what you provide are those localised wraparound services to some of our disadvantaged, and that's exactly what government's looking for. So you've got major strengths there, you've got major weaknesses in financial sustainability, governance arrangements in relation to the standards that are set nationally, and they're the areas we've got to work on to facilitate the AHO and government's policy direction for Aboriginal housing. And just on the topic for today, I was in conversation with the tax office yesterday afternoon with all the other registrars and some of the incentives they're putting into play for tax incentives for registered CHPs. Again, there's a myriad of opportunities that are available and becoming more and more available. The government's incentivising a lot of community housing work to be part of that. There's one key point: need to be registered, and that's registration either through the local scheme or the national scheme, and there's a couple of requirements for that which organisations will need to capacity build to get there. Today I don't want to go into, as a third phase, too much about Aboriginal community housing provider performance. I want to talk a bit about the performance of the CHP sector itself and go into a bit more statistics about that sets the benchmark of where ACHPs, land councils, etc. need to get to over the next couple of years. So I'll talk about some of these things. Just as an overview, we are going to produce a report. My office hasn't produced a report since 2014. So we're going to produce a report in the next couple of weeks which will expand upon some of the information in here and cover off on a lot of performance metrics for the community housing sector in New South Wales and in my jurisdiction as well, and some of our insights from my office about that performance. And I'll go through some of the key highlights today. Probably just in a broader overview sense, the community housing sector in New South Wales has consolidated since moving out of the New South Wales system in 2014-2015. It is preparing at the moment for all these opportunities coming their way through government programs and government initiatives that are going to double the size of the community housing sector in New South Wales. That means the books for some organisations don't look as good as they have in the past because their cash levels, profitability levels are low at the moment because they've been reinvesting their dollars into these new opportunities. So we're expecting quite significant growth in the sector and then to be prepared for that sector in the next few years. But also in overview, there is a measurable difference between the performance of the CHP sector and those providers, and there's a myriad of providers out there across a whole range of different services in addition to housing, but the difference is marked between their performance and the performance of other providers who are managed under contract arrangements. My view as a regulator sitting outside that and can see into both systems is one's incentivised. There are incentives in the CHP sector for good performance and improved performance. And if you're being contract managed and that's the only rules around what you're doing, or there's some sort of self-regulatory system that you're reporting to but it's not visible and not clear, then there's no rationale for reinvesting, for improving, for pursuing better practice. And so behind all these government initiatives at the moment are you need to be registered, meaning you need to be part of a system that can show evidence of long-term sustainability, reinvestment, achieving better practice and so on. So I just want to go through a few broader facts and figures. This is the size of New South Wales sector, which on this side is my data, is national. This NRSCH is the National Regulatory System data. And this is New South Wales properties with primary jurisdiction New South Wales, meaning these are the ones I administer, but the actual assets are in New South Wales. So that's gone up. This figure here is financial year 16. That's the only one I can find around the place. So it's not the same as that financial year 17, but we'd assume that the numbers of residents have gone up slightly as well. Not dramatic. So over a 5-year period, yeah, it's increased. There's been some management transfers. There's been some changes in or creation of new stock, but not dramatic. Over the next 3 to 4 years, these numbers are going to double. And with that comes a lot of opportunity, a lot of new business arrangements for New South Wales providers. Just to give you a sense of the participants in the scheme, the scheme's broken down into 3 tiers, Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3. The Tier 1s are the big providers. There's 20 of those in the New South Wales scheme. So by number, they're quite small, but they manage majority of assets. 25% of the total assets under these providers are owned by the registered providers. The statistics I have from AHO is 30% of assets managed by Aboriginal providers are owned by them. So it's about the same, about 25% are owned by those organisations. There's quite a marked difference between ownership between Tier 1s and Tier 2s. So Tier 1s own a lot more stock than Tier 2s. That's because of the prevalence of aged care operators within the Tier 2 system. And you'll see there's a lot of 114 Tier 3 providers covering a huge spread of different types of organisations, and a lot of Aboriginal housing providers, when they come into the system, will probably come into that Tier 3 level. Just going through a few of the measures that we keep oversight of. Property utilisation is obviously a key one, and traditionally CHPs do this very well because that's their business model more than the public service. The data in this area is still a bit clunky, and we're looking to fix that over this next year. And that data there, the 20 out of 27 providers, is really only for Tier 1s and Tier 2s at this stage, and I'll put out some more reporting on Tier 3s down the track. I want to just show repairs and maintenance. That was on the agenda if you were here for the session before morning tea. Repairs and maintenance is a big one on all the surveys, and the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare study, which has just recently come out on 2016 data, indicates that traditionally CHPs outperform everybody else in repairs and maintenance, and on a survey standard from the actual tenants, noting that a larger proportion of Aboriginal tenants are in CHPs than ACHPs. It picks up that tenant base as well. They generally do well in repairs and maintenance. That data you'll see from AIHW is 2016. We've noticed we're a year ahead of that, and we've noticed some decline across all these 3 indicators from 16 to 17, so we'd be expecting some of the tenant satisfaction reported next year on this year's results to be lower, which is policy guys can start working out a rationale behind that. But largely it's been driven by 4 providers who have changed some contracting maintenance arrangements and reporting systems. And so we're going to be targeting those 4 providers about their repair and maintenance performance to make sure that that's remedied. And again, this is, I use this example of regulatory oversight and what the difference would be between where you're currently at in an ACHP sector and what happens in a national sector. We're not talking about non-compliance here. We're talking about better practice and why they're not achieving better practice standards, which is detracting from the reputation of the sector. And they need to improve that and reinvest in that performance. Financial measures, there's this awful acronym called Earnings Before Interest, Taxation, Depreciation and Amortisation, otherwise known as everything you earn before everything gets cut off from it. So there's quite a different standard, or not quite a different standard, but there's different standards for each of the tiers. We expend a lot of effort assuring organisations' financial performance as regulated entities, so that they can guarantee, or the government can be assured, that the risk they've transferred to the sector is resonating through financial viability over time. So we hold organisations very carefully this sort of margins in their forecasts. Tier 1s and Tier 2s are required to provide a 10-year forecast to us, and we take them into account if it's overcooked or undercooked. We also measure their performance against their forecasts as well. Tier 3s are required to do a 2-year forecast, and again these are the sort of measures that you'll need to show evidence of to join the regulated system. Some of the financial outcomes that we will report on out of that. There's been consistent growth in revenue. These facts and figures are from the Tier 1s and Tier 2s, so the big operators. We are distinguishing in some of this the performance of the aged care operators compared to the traditional or standard CHPs. The aged care operators got a lot of access to a whole range of different fundings and operate on different business models. So we are getting better at comparing apples with apples. But there's been consistent growth in revenue and asset value over the last 3 years. Tier 1 providers experienced growth in community housing assets as a result of transfer, plus also the funding initiatives. And Tier 2 providers experienced growth in non-community housing assets due to the presence of aged care providers. In absolute terms, debt has increased, as I mentioned right from the start. They're wearing more debt, but that's because they're preparing for expansion. Just a few more slides. You can see here differences between, these are the aged care providers, who are quite significant in terms of operating grants compared to what a CHP gets. So aged care providers really distort the market. Really, really big operators, obviously, across the country. Quite smaller footprints in terms of housing, but a few of them are getting more and more into housing operations. I just wanted to show you a few of the stats from the sector itself. There'll be a more fulsome report on this coming out within the next few weeks, which you can read off our renovated website from next week onwards. We haven't done this sort of stuff and talked to the community about performance for a long time now, and we're trying to get out and give a clear indication of what capacity needs to be built in this particular sector, but also for CHPs themselves, what better practice looks like and what our expectations are. So I'll leave it there.